Who was Al-Ghazali?
Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1058–1111, was a philosopher, theologian, jurist, and Sufi mystic. Born in the Middle Eastern region of Khorasan, or Khorasan, and educated in the intellectual center of Nishr, he became head of Nizamiyat, a seminary in Baghdad, where his teachings in law and theology were renowned. He sought certainty in knowledge, and when he could not find it in his academic studies, he resigned his academic post, left his family, and became a Sufi mystic. He wandered for a decade and, as the result of those experiences, returned to Nishapur to resume teaching. Al-Ghazali came to believe that truth can be found only as the result of God's grace. In Deliverance from Error, his spiritual autobiography, he related his futile quest for truth and certainty through both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions and concluded that sensory information and reason were just as lacking. His alternative to rational and sensory knowledge was a light which God Most High cast into my breast. The key to most knowledge. His attack on philosophical authorities as a guide to truth and certainty, particularly in the writings of Avicenna, 980–1037, culminated in the intentions of the philosophers. And in the incoherence of the philosophers he offered a detailed intellectual attack on the views of Plato and Aristotle, which was again directed against Avicenna.
What did Augustine confess in Confessions?
The importance of Augustine's, 354–430, Confessions lies less in what he disclosed about himself and more in its intimate, first-person style of writing, which became a distinct genre in future religious works, as well as philosophical treatises. His Confessions, written when he was in his 40s, relates his religious yearnings, strivings, and happiness. Augustine's early education was in rhetoric and literature. He claims that when, at the age of 18, he read Cicero's now lost dialogue Hortensius, he was inspired to devote his life to the search for wisdom. Although he converted to Christianity in 386, he made a living teaching rhetoric. And for a while his main religious interest was in Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism denied the crucifixion of Jesus, united Christianity with Buddhism, and was preoccupied with struggles between good and evil, or light and darkness. Augustine came into contact with Bishop Ambrose and Christian Neoplatonists in Milan and found a sufficiently sophisticated form of Christianity that appealed to him. Augustine believed that Neoplatonism anticipated the basic Christian doctrines about God, the creation, and divine presence. When he returned to his home in North Africa, he was ordained as a priest and then became Bishop of Hippo. He preached, traveled, and corresponded voluminously. In his scholarly and devotional activities, he came to believe that the Christian scriptures particularly the Gospel account of the life of Jesus, were more important than the writings of philosophers. He concluded that more important than belief, which was an intellectual matter, was understanding, which began with faith. Believe in order that you may understand. Understanding required a vision of God.
What did St. Anselm of Canterbury begin?
St. Anselm, 1033 to 1109, known as Anselm of Canterbury, was a Benedictine monk and the second Norman Archbishop of Canterbury. He is famous for his ontological proof for the existence of God in proslogion, and for his model of satisfaction in the atonement in his Cur Deus Homo. Anselm's ontological argument to prove God's existence amounts to this. Imagine a being that is the greatest being that can be imagined. Such a being exists in the intellect alone. If this greatest being were to exist only in the intellect, a greater one that existed in reality could be imagined. But there cannot exist in reality a greater being than the greatest being that can be imagined. Therefore, that imagined being is the greatest being. Now, this greatest being would be everything and have every attribute that it is better to have than not to have. Living, wise, powerful, true, just, blessed. Unchangeable, non-physical, eternal, beautiful, harmonious, sweet, and so forth. That is, and this is the crux of the ontological argument, because being is better than non-being. God will have being, which is to say, he will exist. Anselm goes on to claim that God, as the greatest being that can be imagined, is simple. Everything that exists is better insofar as it more resembles the creator of all things, namely, God. All created beings, which are created by God, owe their being and well-being to God. But God is independent and has no obligations to his creations.
Did Anselm face objections to his ontological argument?
Yes. Also, different forms of Saint Anselm's, 1033 to 1109, argument kept popping up in the history of philosophy after Anselm died, as did different objections to it. It remains a subject of debate in some circles to this day. Anselm had posed his argument as something that a fool who did not believe in God would have to agree with. His contemporary, a monk called Gonilon, took up the position of the fool. Gonilon first said that it was impossible to conceive or imagine a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm's response was that if the words "a being than which nothing greater can be conceived" are understood, then one, the fool, has conceived of or imagined this being. And because this being is so great and existence or being is greater than non-existence or non-being, the being exists.
How did political events after the decline of Greece change philosophy?
The death of Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BCE, marked the end of the classical period in Greek philosophy. The Greek cities were unable to unify after great losses in the Peloponnesian War. 431 to 404 BCE. The next 800 years marked a period of great instability. As the political and cultural center of Western civilization shifted to Europe. As Rome came to dominate Greece, the uncontested brilliance of the Greeks faded into the past. Toward the end of this historical period, Christian thought and practice began to define almost every aspect of civilized life. Some pre-Socratic thought, particularly the ideas and practices of Pythagoras, lived on after the decline of Greece. Plato's work endured in new forms that were compatible with early Christianity. The Hellenistic or Greek-based forms of the new philosophies of skepticism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and cynicism spread throughout the Mediterranean world. There was little awareness of Aristotle's work at the time, although empiricism was easily accepted.
Who was Pyrrho of Elais?
Pyrrho, c. 360 to 275, started out as a painter and then became interested in Democritus. c. 460 to 371 BCE, atomism. He traveled with Alexander the Great to the east, where he studied with the gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. He had students but left no written work. When he would refuse to judge whether a chariot headed his way would hit him, his students often had to rescue him at the last second.
Who were the encyclopedists?
They were scholars who attempted to systematically present all of human knowledge at their time. Chief among them were Boethius, 480 c. 525, of Italy, whose work went far beyond the alphabetized. Speculations of the other two who best represented this period, St. Isidore of Seville, 560 to 636, and the Venerable Bede of Britain, 674 to 735. Both Isidore and the Bede were clerics who devoted their lives to ecclesiastical service. Isidore compiled Etymologia, or Origins, which was a systematic presentation of all available learning during his time and endured as a textbook in church schools for hundreds of years. The Venerable Bede was best known for his histories, particularly that of Britain. The next real philosophical luminary was Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 815 to 877.
Who were the Stoics and what did they believe?
Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, 334–262 B. CE, whose work was carried on by Cleanthes, 331–322 BCE. Who was then succeeded by Chrysippus, c. 280–206 BCE. The name Stoic came from the stoapoikil, or painted colonnade, where Stoics first gathered in Athens. According to these early Stoics, the entire world is a morally good organism, with different phases in which events operate according to divine reason, or logos. The sequence of events is predetermined by fate. Each world phase ends in a big fire and is then repeated in a continuous, never-ending cycle. Early Stoic ethics held that only virtue is good, and only vice is bad. Other things, such as health or wealth, may be preferred, but they are morally indifferent. We each have a unique role in the world plan and our job is to learn what it is. Such learning creates concern for the self, which can and should be extended to close relatives and friends and, after them, all humanity. The Stoics may have been the first cosmopolitans. Learning is based on assent to impressions. Until all of a person's thoughts become related and unassailable by reason. By counseling that we assent to impressions, the Stoics meant that we should not deny anything that is presented to us as either a fact or an opinion, but simply acknowledge its effect on us. Such Stoic certainty formed the dogmatism opposed by the skeptics.
Why was Pyrrho important?
His refusal to make judgments was an important school of skepticism that was developed after the Renaissance and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, known as Pyrrhonic skepticism. It was the general philosophical approach that many things in human life cannot be known.
Who were the scholastics?
The scholastics were the first heavyweight philosophical school of medieval times. Their 11th century founder was St. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033–1109, who was followed by Peter Abelard, 1079–1142, and Peter Lombard, 1100–1160, in the 12th century. During the same time, Jewish and Islamic philosophers reintroduced Aristotle to the West. This innovation culminated in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, followed by John Duns Scotus, 1266–1308.
What are some examples of the perplexities Maimonides set out in his Guide of the Perplexed?
First, and perhaps foremost, was the question posed in Guide of the perplexed of what kind of knowledge it is possible for people to have of God. According to the doctrine of negative theology, which Maimonides took over from Avicenna. 980-1037, nothing positive can be known about God. Because God has nothing in common with any other being experienced by humans, and humans have no experience of God. All that we can know is what God is not. Negative theology is the doctrine that God cannot be known by man. Second, there is a contradiction between the idea of God on which Judaism is founded and the philosophical, Aristotelian idea of God. The philosophical idea is that God is intellect, whereas the religious idea is that it cannot be known what God is. Maimonides, 1135-1204. Sums up this problem with what he calls very disgraceful conclusions in the following passage. Namely, it would follow that the deity, whom everyone who is intelligent recognizes to be perfect in every kind of perfection, could, as far as all beings are concerned, produce nothing new in any of them. If he wished to lengthen a fly's wing or shorten a worm's foot, he would not be able to do so. But Aristotle would say that he would not wish it and that it is impossible to will something different from what is, that it would not add to his perfection, but would perhaps from a certain point of view be a deficiency. Third, Maimonides rejected the Aristotelian doctrine of the eternity of the world. Although he could offer no conclusive rational justification for this rejection, neither did he affirm that this was an issue in which religion was definitively correct.
What is ancient cynicism?
The Cynics were eccentrics who chose to be outcasts rather than kowtow to social norms that did not make sense to them. Ancient cynicism was generally an attempt to reassert the importance of human nature as independent of society and custom. This was very different from our modern definition of a cynic as someone who is skeptical and tends to believe the worst about people. The Cynics derived from Antisthenes of Athens, c. 445-360 BCE, who studied with Gorgias, c. 485-380 BCE, and was a good friend of Socrates, 460-399 BCE. Even being present at his death, Antisthenes claimed to be proudest of his wealth, because, having no money, he was pleased with what he had. He thought that a virtuous person could always be happier than a non-virtuous one, and that the soul was more important than the body. Antisthenes' minimalist ideas about what was necessary to live well were carried on by Diogenes of Sinope, 400-325 BCE, who lived in a wine barrel, claimed that cannibalism and incest were fine practices, and was said to carry a lamp in daylight in search of an honest person. Diogenes' successor was Crates of Thebes, fluid 328 BCE, who gave up his wealth to practice cynicism, but also married. He believed that asceticism was necessary for independence, and claimed that lentils were better than oysters.
What happened in Athens after both Plato and Aristotle were gone?
Athens remained the center of philosophy until the Romans sacked it in 87 CE. Much of our knowledge of Hellenistic philosophical activity comes from the 1st century BCE Roman writers Lucretius, 99–55 BCE, and Cicero, 106–43 BCE, and secondary medieval sources. Plato's Academy became the new academy, which was devoted to critical work on the thought of other schools. This was the beginning of the skeptics. Aristotle's Lyceum, or the Peripatos, was first led by Theophrastus in 322 BCE. But after 287 BCE, it fell into decline until the middle of the 1st century BCE.
Who was Avicenna?
Avicenna, 980–1037, was a Persian physician and commentator on Aristotle. He was born near Bokhara, which was then the capital of the Samanid dynasty, located in present-day Uzbekistan. By the age of 10, he had mastery of the Quran and Arabic grammar and literature. By 16, he was highly knowledgeable about natural science, metaphysics, and theories of medicine. He also treated the sick and helped the Samanid prince Nut ibn Mansur, 976–997. His reward for that was access to the prince's library. Avicenna became an expert on the writings of Aristotle, wrote extensive commentaries, and also produced many treatises of his own on science, religion, and philosophy. His medical encyclopedia, Al-Shifa, The Healing, was based on Aristotle's work, and his Al-Qanun fi Tibb, The Canon of Medicine, written when he was 21, became famous throughout the Middle East and Europe. As an Aristotelian interpreter, he was well known for claiming that the universality of our ideas is a product of the mind. He was not a complete nominalist about universals, however, because he thought that there were differences and similarities among things of the same kind, which existed independently of thought. The products of thought were the formal qualities of things. This doctrine, known as intellectus informis agit universalitatem, neatly corresponded with Aristotle's claim that scientific knowledge consisted in truths about forms or essences. However, although Avicenna's interpretation of Aristotle seemed to be rather staid and unoriginal, his claim that it could be reconciled with Islam was soon challenged by Al-Ghazali, 1058–1111. And in the generation after that it was radically revised, along with Al-Ghazali's objections, by Averroës, c. 1126 c. 1198.
What was in Saint Isidore's encyclopedia?
Saint Isidore of Seville's, c. 560-636, Encyclopedia de Etymologia was an ambitious attempt to compile all the knowledge of its day in one source. It contained everything that was known and believed at the time, with little critical editing. For example, under A was an entry on the atomic theory, but there was also an entry on the mythical antipodes, who were said to populate rocky plains in the south of Africa. Isidore related that their big toes were not on the inside of their feet, but on the outside, which afforded them greater agility in navigating their rocky terrain.
Why was Averroës considered important by other philosophers?
Averroës, known as Ibn Rushd in the Islamic world, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born in Córdoba, Spain. He brought the tradition of comparative philosophy begun by Avicenna and rendered problematic by Al-Ghazali to a new level of intellectual sophistication. His main project was to settle the debate among his contemporaries about whether Aristotle's philosophy was compatible with Islam. As Avicenna had claimed, or opposed to it as Al-Ghazali, 1058-1111, had objected.
Why did philosophers love Maimonides?
Maimonides, 1135-1204, provided a justification for philosophical thought in a religious context at a time when philosophers feared persecution from religious authorities. The problems Maimonides raised in reconciling Aristotelian philosophy or the best conclusions of reason at that time with religion brought into religion itself philosophical problems about the limits of knowledge and what ought to be concluded when reason has run out.
What was skepticism?
Skepticism was founded by R.C. Selous, who was head of the new academy from 268 to 241. His work was carried on by Maimonides, head of the academy in the 2nd century B.C.E. The skeptics held that nothing could be known, and they preached epis, which is the doctrine that all judgments, or conclusions, or assessments, should be suspended. These academic skeptics posed problems, or tropes, to show that sensory knowledge is prone to error and reasoning does not necessarily result in certainty. They concluded that because we have no absolute standards for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, the best we can hope for is probable knowledge.
Augustine's role at the beginning of medieval philosophy?
St. Augustine, Aurelius Augustinus, 354–430. Was a pivotal figure in the transition between classical and medieval thought. Some see him as the last of the great classical thinkers, whereas others claim him as the first medieval thinker. He lived through the decline of the Roman Empire, with its political turmoil and military failures, and the Roman state's acceptance of Christianity as the official religion. Just before Augustine died, the Vandals were burning and sacking Hippo, where he was bishop. Augustine's most influential works are Confessions on the Trinity, on Genesis according to the letter, and City of God. They all reflect his own faith after conversion and provide an intellectual structure for much Christian writing that followed. Although Augustine's initial education was in rhetoric, his later studies in Neoplatonism deeply influenced his religious understanding. Still, he approached philosophy in terms of how it could serve religion, rather than as a valuable discipline in its own right. This secondary status of philosophy was widely accepted by philosophers throughout the medieval period. Augustine was one of the early Church Fathers and was canonized as a saint. By popular acclaim, as was the custom during the early centuries of the Catholic Church.
What did Aristotle think about government and politics?
Aristotle believed that human beings are social by nature. So the right form of government is necessary to support happy and self-sufficient citizens. He posited three main forms of government, each of which could degenerate. Monarchy that could fall into tyranny, aristocracy that could fall into oligarchy. Rule by a few based on wealth, and polity that could fall into democracy. Like Plato, Aristotle viewed democracy as mob rule because the great masses of people in their day were uneducated and unrefined. Aristotle thought that the best form of government was polity, a kind of democratic rule within an aristocratic class, where turns were taken for top positions and all of the privileged members had their say.
Who was Johannes Scotus Eriugena?
Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 810–877, also known as John Scotus Eriugena, was a Christian rationalist. Literally, his name means John the Irishman, the Irishman. King John the Bold called him to his Palatine school to translate the Pseudo-Dionysius. This document was falsely attributed to Saint Dionysius, d. 268, a convert of Saint Paul. Although it was in fact written by an unknown Neoplatonist, Eriugena's translation was initially a success. Building on its main ideas, he constructed his own system, De Divis Ioni Naturae. His basic premise was that logical reasoning ought to be compatible with Christian philosophy. This meant that the teachings of the Church Fathers could be criticized, if necessary. More heretically than that, it left no room for faith in divine creation and salvation. Eriugenes' treatise was condemned by Pope Honorius III, 1148–1227, in 1225.
What is Sufism?
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. Its classical period, or Golden Age, was from 1000 to 1500. Sufism is believed to have branched out from Baghdad to spread through Persia, India, North Africa, and Spain. The movement supported lodges and hospices for students, Sufi adepts, and others visiting on retreat. Sufi practitioners were expected to go through different levels of spirituality. First were the stations, requiring acts of will and actions to suppress individual egos and attachment to and desire for worldly things. This would lead to God's grace. Once God's grace was granted, it could be experienced individually as love, mystical knowledge, or the loss of ego consciousness. Sufism began as a marginal practice but was accepted by Islamic leaders in the 11th century. Mainly through Al-Ghazali's, 1058–1111, efforts. Sufism then developed along distinct practical and intellectual directions. The practical paths required training in religious formulas and initiation into orders. It was accompanied by many fraternal and social organizations that continue in the present Islamic world. The intellectual path developed philosophical terminology and absorbed Neoplatonic influences, culminating in Ibn Arabi's, d. 1240, system of theosophy. Within that system, God was held to be the only being. Everything else in existence was the result of his self-manifestation. The individual who could identify with all of God's self-manifestations would have the goal of becoming the perfect man, thus far attained only by the Prophet Muhammad. It is perhaps ironic that this intellectual path of Sufism developed when Al-Ghazali had embraced Sufism as part of a belief that knowledge and reasoning was not a reliable way to experience God.
What was the debate between the Pharonean and academic skeptics?
Pyrrhonian skepticism was founded by Aenesidemus in the early 1st century B. CE. Aenesidemus claimed to be merely passing on the thoughts of Pharaoh of Elis, c. 315–255 BCE. Sextus Empiricus, 160–210 CE, preserved Pyrrhonian skepticism in the 2nd century after Aenesidemus. Pyrrhonian skeptics thought that the academic skeptics went too far in claiming that nothing could be truly known for certain. The Pyrrhonians preferred to suspend judgment on whether anything could be known. They held that suspending judgment led to ataraxiapies of mind in which there was simply no concern for what may or may not lie behind appearances or come after them. Pyrrhonian skeptics were opposed to dogmatism and believed that their chief philosophic opponents were the Stoics.
What was the importance of Jewish philosophy in medieval thought?
Moses Maimonides, or Moses son of Maimon, 1135–1204, who is also referred to as Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. Rambam had an extensive influence on subsequent Jewish scholarship, the ideas of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, and many scholars thereafter. Maimonides, like Averroës, c. 1126 c. 1198. Was born in Córdoba, Spain, and, also like Averroës, pursued an intense interest in Aristotle. While he intended his writings to be restricted to Jewish readers, his insights about the relationship between monotheistic religious beliefs and classical philosophical insights were studied by both Catholic and Islamic thinkers, as well as Jewish philosophers and theologians.
That is, should we say that the limits of reason are the limits of human knowledge? Or should we extend the limits of reason into the domain of religious faith and revelation?
Strictly speaking, these are questions of how we ought to think about religion. In the Middle Ages, which was the great age of religion, philosophers were constrained to begin their philosophizing with basic assumptions that God existed and that he was good. But philosophers have always been motivated to push through to the limits of knowledge and seek certainty within those limits. By deploying Aristotle as the personification of philosophy, Maimonides was able to raise necessarily covered questions of whether reason could justify belief in the existence and teachings not only of the Judaic version of God, but also of the Christian, and perhaps Muslim, God. We should remember that such questions, had they not been posed under the cover of the august and unquestionable authority of the philosopher himself, namely, Aristotle, would have resulted in loss of livelihood, excommunication, banishment or ostracism from the community of the devout and faithful, and also death itself. Philosophers were not stupid in the great age of religion. Notwithstanding their apparent devotion to varied theological regimes and their leaders, who it just so happened controlled all aspects of social, political, and economic life in Europe and the Middle East, at the same time that they upheld specific religious doctrines.
What was impressive about Averroës' life and work?
Averroës, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born into a prominent family of lawyers and judges, and was himself trained as a lawyer in both civil and religious affairs. He traveled from Córdoba to Marrakech in 1153 and decided that Aristotle had been correct in stating that the world was round when he was able to observe Canope, a star not visible in Spain. He served as both advisor and doctor to the Sultan of Marrakesh, who encouraged a series of commentaries on Aristotle. His writings include treatises on medicine and astronomy, but he is best known for his The Incoherence of Incoherence, which was a reply to Al-Ghazali's, 1058-1111, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In his Incoherence of Incoherence, Averroës defended natural reason as a means to attain knowledge in all domains. By natural reason Averroës, and others after him, meant ordinary thought processes rather than religious intuition or revelation. Averroës also wrote a set of commentaries on Aristotle that was influential in Western medieval scholarship. When his interpretations of Aristotle did not square with his own assumptions, he wrote detailed supplements of his own. For example, Aristotle's Physics and On the Heavens were composed as two separate works and based on different types of observations. Under Plato's influence, Averroës assumed that they were united.
What were Averroës' most noteworthy ideas?
Overall, Averroës, c. 1126–c. 1198, Aristotelian views were shaped by Platonic ideas, partly because he mistakenly believed that the whole of ancient Greek thought was one unified system that had been composed cooperatively. He also believed that, according to Aristotle, all of the sciences could be studied with the same meaning of being, whereas Aristotle had insisted that the sciences were diverse and their subject matter inherently different. Averroës viewed all of nature as one harmonious order. On the subject of immortality, this holism was related to his idea that individual souls are not distinguished from one another after death, but combine into one form. Averroës also interpreted Aristotle as claiming that Earth was eternal, which was against Christian doctrine of the creation. On the harmony between religion and philosophy, Averroës tried to show that the same truth can be reached through different means, dialectic in law, philosophy for those skilled in the use of pure reason, and rhetoric for those with only a general education.
What is Epicureanism?
Unlike its namesake today, which connotes an enjoyment of good food and fine wine, ancient Epicureanism was an austere doctrine. It was founded by Epicurus, 341–271 BCE, and his colleagues Metrodorus of Lampsacus, 331–277 BCE, Hermarchus, dates unknown, and Polyaenus, dates unknown. Epicurus set up communities at Mytilene, Lampsacus, and on the outskirts of Athens, where his school was known as the Garden. Epicurean practice required detachment from political life, although not opposition to it and time spent in philosophical discussion with friends. Epicurus wrote letters on physics, astronomy, and ethics, as well as maxims, and a major work, on nature, little of which has survived. He was an atomist, as Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE, had developed the theory. Except that he thought atoms themselves contained sets of minima, parts of atoms that cannot be further divided. According to Epicurus, the atoms are in constant motion, with swerves and collisions that have resulted in the formation of bodies as we experience them. There is nothing godlike outside of life and society as we know them. And the gods should just be viewed as ideal models for our own behavior. Death is not to be feared, because we will merely dissolve into our constituent atoms, which are incapable of feeling pain or anything else. Epicurean ethics held that pleasure is our only good, it is better even than virtue. Pain is the only evil. Pleasure should be sought in stable ways, which makes a simple life necessary. We should satisfy only our most necessary desires in the company of friends like us. The highest pleasures are katastematic, or those related to satisfaction. The kinetic pleasures that result from stimulation merely increase our insecurity. They are like desires. Our ultimate goal should therefore be the absence of pain via a simple life for the body and the study of physics for the soul. This will result in ataraxia, or freedom from disturbance.
Who are some Dark Ages philosophers who came after St. Augustine?
After St. Augustine's death in 430, the so-called Dark Ages, roughly 420 to 1000 CE, ensued. In 420 the Visigoths living inside of Rome sacked the city. In monasteries in Italy, Spain, and Britain, the encyclopedists emerged.
Who were the important philosophers of Middle Stoicism?
Middle Stoicism matured in Rhodes, with Maimonides, c. 185 to 110 BCE, and Posidonius, c. 125 to 50 BCE. Both of whom influenced the statesman and writer Cicero, 106 to 43 BCE. Posidonius, c. 125 to 50 BCE. Incorporated both Platonic and Aristotelian ideas into his views. The main accomplishment of Middle Stoicism was to apply Greek ideas to military and political life in Roman culture. Middle Stoicism was generally more focused on how those who were Stoics could weather specific life problems, such as defeat in war, or imprisonment.
How did Augustine support the theology of the Church with philosophy?
St. Augustine, 354–430, tried to justify the whole of human knowledge, even though he also allowed for error. All knowledge, according to Augustine, resided within the soul as a substance endowed with reason and fitted to rule a body. While the soul can act on the body cannot act on the soul. God is always present to the soul, whether the soul is aware of his light or turns away from it. These views of Augustine established the superiority of religion to philosophy and also embedded God in the same human faculty associated with non-religious understanding to the elevation of religious understanding. Augustine's greatest work was the City of God, in which he separated the temporal state, government on earth, from the religious realm of the afterlife. The temporal state was to have a secondary role in ensuring peace, order, safety, and physical well-being for its citizens. The heavenly city, by contrast, requires living according to God's rules. Although the temporal and heavenly cities may at times overlap, only God's city is eternal.
What did St. Augustine mean when he said, "Please God, make me good"?
St. Augustine, 354–430, considered himself profligate in his youth, much to the distress of his mother, Monica. In his Confessions, which recounts some of this early history, he is famous for having written what is often repeated as, "Please God, make me good, but not just yet." However, some scholars think that a more accurate translation of the Latin is, "Oh, Master, make me chaste and celibate but not yet." They also think that Augustine was not so much talking about his past self as he was ironically criticizing all who lack resolve about developing their virtues and devoting themselves to God. Augustine's sins were probably not as great as his oft-quoted remark has led many to believe. As a youth, before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine was fond of drink and women. He had an illegitimate son in 372, but was in a 15-year relationship with the child's mother, which would have been considered perfectly respectable at the time.
What is Roman Stoicism?
Roman Stoicism was developed by Seneca the Younger, 1–65 c. E. Epictetus, c. 55–135 CE, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 121–80 CE. Who wrote Meditations. Many were moved by Marcus Aurelius' advice about restraining anger at his weak subjects. Do not be turned into Caesar, or dyed by the purple, for that happens. Roman Stoicism was influential in the Renaissance and the modern period, and to this day it underlies codes of behavior and moral values in military communities. The basic Stoic premise is that we are obligated to understand the nature of the things we deal with and be prepared to accept, without fuss, unwanted events that are not under our control. Epictetus is famous for saying that if your favorite clay pot breaks, you should remember that it was always fragile and not yours to begin with. And if your spouse or child dies, that is a reminder that they are mortals. Something that we should always remember about the human beings we love.
Who was Thomas Aquinas and what made him known as the greatest medieval philosopher?
St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was born in Roccasecca, Italy. He began his religious studies in a Benedictine monastery and studied liberal arts at the University of Naples. He entered the Dominican order of preachers when he was only 20. He studied theology in Paris, attaining his doctorate in 1256, and taught there until 1259. Aquinas then lectured on theology and philosophy at Dominican monasteries near Rome, and then returned to the University of Paris. He taught for a year in Naples in 1272. Aquinas died near his place of birth, while traveling to a church council in Lyons. During his teaching career, which spanned from 1252 to 1273, Aquinas wrote extensively. He lucidly solved long-standing problems in the interpretation of Aristotle, made clear distinctions between Christian theology and philosophy, and demonstrated how the two were compatible on many subtle points.
Who was Thomas Aquinas and what made him known as the greatest medieval philosopher?
St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was born in Roccasecca, Italy. He began his religious studies in a Benedictine monastery and studied liberal arts at the University of Naples. He entered the Dominican order of preachers when he was only 20. He studied theology in Paris, attaining his doctorate in 1256, and taught there until 1259. Aquinas then lectured on theology and philosophy at Dominican monasteries near Rome, and then returned to the University of Paris. He taught for a year in Naples in 1272. Aquinas died near his place of birth, while traveling to a church council in Lyons. During his teaching career, which spanned from 1252 to 1273, Aquinas wrote extensively. He lucidly solved long-standing problems in the interpretation of Aristotle, made clear distinctions between Christian theology and philosophy, and demonstrated how the two were compatible on many subtle points.
What are the major works of Thomas Aquinas?
Aquinas, 1224–1274, wrote prodigiously throughout his life. and his works include commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, reports on Albertus Magnus. 1200 to 1280, lectures, a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, c. 1095 to 1160, and other philosophical treatises such as On Being and Essence and On the Principles of Nature, as well as on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists. He is most famous for his Summa against the Gentiles and Summa on Theology.
What are the major works of Thomas Aquinas?
Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, wrote prodigiously throughout his life, and his works include commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, reports on Albertus Magnus. 1200 to 1280, lectures, a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, c. 1095 to 1160, and other philosophical treatises such as On Being and Essence and On the Principles of Nature, as well as on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists. He is most famous for his Summa against the Gentiles and Summa on Theology.
What were Thomas Aquinas' main original ideas?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, was deeply influenced by the work of the Aristotelians, as well as the Stoics, Neoplatonists, and St. Augustine, 354 to 430, his resolution of past philosophy with Christian theology is considered unique. Many of his solutions to standing problems display moderation without intellectual compromise. For instance, his position on universals. Whether or not general terms name general things that exist, is even called moderate realism. Aquinas did not believe that universals exist, but he did posit a foundation outside of the human mind for universals and truths about them. That foundation was the fact that individual things of the same kind, which are referred to by the name of that kind, e.g., specific cats that are called cats, have real similarities and resemblances. Whether or not this solution did more than restate the problem remains an open question. But it definitely impressed many as a new way of thinking about the old problem of universals.
What were Thomas Aquinas' main original ideas?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, was deeply influenced by the work of the Aristotelians, as well as the Stoics, Neoplatonists, and St. Augustine, 354 to 430, his resolution of past philosophy with Christian theology is considered unique. Many of his solutions to standing problems display moderation without intellectual compromise. For instance, his position on universals. Whether or not general terms name general things that exist, is even called moderate realism. Aquinas did not believe that universals exist. But he did posit a foundation outside of the human mind for universals and truths about them. That foundation was the fact that individual things of the same kind, which are referred to by the name of that kind, e.g., specific cats that are called cats, have real similarities and resemblances. Whether or not this solution did more than restate the problem remains an open question. But it definitely impressed many as a new way of thinking about the old problem of universals.
Was Aquinas able to solve the conflict between faith and reason?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, redefined faith as a kind of knowledge, rather than as a specific feeling or attitude of mind. As such, he said that faith fell between opinion and scientific knowledge. Faith was greater than opinion because it involved strong agreement, as an act of will. And it was less than scientific knowledge because it lacked factual evidence that could compel agreement. Aquinas thought that philosophy was reasoning based on existing knowledge or experience, leading to new knowledge, which he called the way of discovery. He held that philosophy was also the use of reason to confirm beliefs by tracing them back to basic principles, which he called the way of reduction. Philosophy becomes theology if the beliefs one begins with are based on faith. There are, in turn, two kinds of theology: truths in Scripture that are learned for their own sake, and metaphysics or explanations based on religious principles. Despite his theological idea of metaphysics, Aquinas did distinguish between philosophy and theology. For instance, in De Aeternitate Mundi, although he held the religious belief that the universe was not eternal, he said that it might be eternal based on philosophical reasoning. In general, apart from religious revelation, Aquinas believed that we get our knowledge from sense experience, and our intellectual understanding of our sense experience did St.
Was Aquinas able to solve the conflict between faith and reason?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, redefined faith as a kind of knowledge, rather than as a specific feeling or attitude of mind. As such, he said that faith fell between opinion and scientific knowledge. Faith was greater than opinion because it involved strong agreement, as an act of will. And it was less than scientific knowledge because it lacked factual evidence that could compel agreement. Aquinas thought that philosophy was reasoning based on existing knowledge or experience, leading to new knowledge, which he called the way of discovery. He held that philosophy was also the use of reason to confirm beliefs by tracing them back to basic principles, which he called the way of reduction. Philosophy becomes theology if the beliefs one begins with are based on faith. There are, in turn, two kinds of theology: truths in Scripture that are learned for their own sake, and metaphysics or explanations based on religious principles. Despite his theological idea of metaphysics, Aquinas did distinguish between philosophy and theology. For instance, in De Aeternitate Mundi, although he held the religious belief that the universe was not eternal, he said that it might be eternal based on philosophical reasoning. In general, apart from religious revelation, Aquinas believed that we get our knowledge from sense experience and our intellectual understanding of our sense experience. Did St.
Aquinas really have a recipe for making mice?
Many of his contemporaries, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed in the spontaneous generation of insects and vermin. The doctrine of spontaneous generation held that life could literally just appear without the prior presence of parent organisms. This biological mythology went back to Aristotle and is in fact strangely empirical, if you think about it. Flies, for example, do suddenly seem to appear out of rotting garbage. It took a long time, well into the 17th century, to discover that the maggots they spring from come from eggs laid by parent flies. Aquinas thought that insects sprang to life in filth, owing to the devil's influence. He thought that the development of mice, however, depended on changes in the positions of the stars. As proof of this origin of baby mice, Aquinas had a recipe. Take some old rags and wheat and leave them undisturbed in a drawer for a while, to give the stars enough time to exert their effects, and then take a peek. Again, there is a crude empiricism at work here. If there are mice in a dwelling, its inhabitants rarely see them breed. And rarer still do they observe female mice building nests and giving birth. If this has happened in a neglected drawer, all that may be evident when one suddenly opens it is the litter of pink babies when the last time one looked there was nothing but old rags and wheat. If you try this at home, the wheat is probably unnecessary. Although the mother mouse will doubtless appreciate it.
Aquinas really have a recipe for making mice?
Many of his contemporaries, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed in the spontaneous generation of insects and vermin. The doctrine of spontaneous generation held that life could literally just appear without the prior presence of parent organisms. This biological mythology went back to Aristotle and is in fact strangely empirical, if you think about it. Flies, for example, do suddenly seem to appear out of rotting garbage. It took a long time, well into the 17th century, to discover that the maggots they spring from come from eggs laid by parent flies. Aquinas thought that insects sprang to life in filth, owing to the devil's influence. He thought that the development of mice, however, depended on changes in the positions of the stars. As proof of this origin of baby mice, Aquinas had a recipe. Take some old rags and wheat and leave them undisturbed in a drawer for a while, to give the stars enough time to exert their effects, and then take a peek. Again, there is a crude empiricism at work here. If there are mice in a dwelling, its inhabitants rarely see them breed. And rarer still do they observe female mice building nests and giving birth. If this has happened in a neglected drawer, all that may be evident when one suddenly opens it is the litter of pink babies when the last time one looked there was nothing but old rags and wheat. If you try this at home, the wheat is probably unnecessary. Although the mother mouse will doubtless appreciate it.
What were Aquinas' views on science?
As an Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed that every object has its proper place. He also held the Eudoxian astronomical view that Earth was in the center of 49 to 53 concentric spheres. However, he thought that scientific conclusions required judgment and assessment, so that all findings and reports should be considered and compared. He also believed that scientific information could be changed and revised, which is a strong tenet of modern empiricism.
What were Aquinas' views on science?
As an Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed that every object has its proper place. He also held the Eudoxian astronomical view that Earth was in the center of 49 to 53 concentric spheres. However, he thought that scientific conclusions required judgment and assessment, so that all findings and reports should be considered and compared. He also believed that scientific information could be changed and revised, which is a strong tenet of modern empiricism.
What did Aquinas think about the soul?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, carefully and meticulously investigated what was known in general about human senses, intellect, will, and emotions, he believed that the human being is the whole of all these faculties or powers. Simply put, the physical body is the matter or material of a human being, and its form or soul is its substantial form. That the soul can understand general truths and exercise free will proves its non-materiality. The reality of the soul is its spirituality. Because the soul cannot be divided, it cannot be corrupted and is therefore immortal. Furthermore, because the soul cannot be divided, it cannot be the result of biological inheritance but is made directly by God, each time a person is born. This divine intervention at birth gives the biological process of human reproduction a dignity and sanctity that elevates the institution of marriage.
What did Aquinas think about the soul?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, carefully and meticulously investigated what was known in general about human senses, intellect, will, and emotions, he believed that the human being is the whole of all these faculties or powers. Simply put, the physical body is the matter or material of a human being, and its form or soul is its substantial form. That the soul can understand general truths and exercise free will proves its non-materiality. The reality of the soul is its spirituality. Because the soul cannot be divided, it cannot be corrupted and is therefore immortal. Furthermore, because the soul cannot be divided, it cannot be the result of biological inheritance but is made directly by God, each time a person is born. This divine intervention at birth gives the biological process of human reproduction a dignity and sanctity that elevates the institution of marriage.